Good morning. Sorry, recording in progress always gets me. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session of the event today. And we are having slight technical difficulties, but nothing that we cannot overcome. So at any given point in time, I'm not quite sure who is with us and who is not. So if I'm taking over someone's role, please tell me that you're here and tell me to be quiet. So my name is Constantia Putuki. I am a full professor at the University of Montreal, and I'm also president of ILA Canada, so International Law Association in Canada. And in these capacities, I am chairing along with Professor Ilaria Espa from the Università della Stiresa Italiana, who I believe is there. Yay! The way that we have set this out is Ilaria is going to introduce the panelists for today. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Christina Carvalho, is not with us today. But everybody else is either in the room or online. And so I will pass over the role right now of chair to Ilaria, so she may introduce our speakers, discussants for the day.
Thank you so much, Constancia, and thank you so much for the opportunity to introduce the speakers. We have a very distinguished panel today who's going to be able to explore issues around sustainable natural resources stewardship and the relevance for biodiversity. I will just right away start introducing them. Of course, it would be impossible to give justice in just a few minutes to their very, very, very rich careers full of achievements. So I will just give a few highlights. Professor Simi Payne is an associate professor at Rutgers University. She's also the head of the Oceans team at the IUCN, World Commission in Environmental Law. She's also been known for her work on global governance of environment and natural resources and the consequent evolution of international law, being also in landmark decision on the legal responsibility of aggressor states for the restoration and remediation of damage to the environment from hard conflict, acting as counsel to the United Nations Compensation Commission in Geneva. And she's also been a director of the Global Commons Project at University of California, Berkeley's Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. We also have Dr. Marcus Gehring, who's been with you already during the opening, so probably I will keep this very short, but you know, is at the Lauterbach Center for International Law in Cambridge, is lead counsel of the Trade, Investment and Finance Program, CISDL, is also going to chair one of the following sessions. We have then Advocate Maria del Pilar Vanegas Guzman. She's a Colombian lawyer. She's the founder and president of ILA Colombia, but she's also had a very incredible experience as a delegate for the International Committee of the Red Cross for 10 years, covering various corners of the world: Rwanda, Central Asia, the Balkans, Israel, the occupied territories, Guinea, Peru, Northeast Nigeria. So a very, very full and rich experience all over the world. We have Professor Alexandra Harrington, who's a lecturer in law at Lancaster University Law School. She's also the chair of the IUCN Task Force on Plastic Pollution and director of studies of the International Law Association of Colombia. She has also recently served as Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Global Governance. And she's also been for a long time one of the pillars of CISDL. Being involved in the human rights program and as director of research. And then we have advocate Cairo Rob, who's edited the International Environmental Law Reports for Cambridge University Press, while she was also research fellow at the Lauterpacht Center for International Law at the University of Cambridge. And then she's worked as policy advisor in the Sustainable Development Unit of the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And also completed a stage at the International Affairs Unit of the DG Environment of the European Commission, and worked pro bono in a pro bono capacity as a caseworker for the UK Environmental Law Foundation. We also have the pleasure to have with us Alessandra Lemon, who's a Brazilian, a top Brazilian, one of the top Brazilian environmental attorneys, as recognized for 8 consecutive years by British publication PLC, which lawyer, and is also a member of the advisory board of the Environmental Council of the Federation of the Industries of the Rio Grande do Sul state. And she also represents the Federation of the Industries in the capacity of a policy advocate at the Permanent Technical Chamber of Legal Matters of the Environmental Council of the state of Rio Grande do Sul. So we are really fortunate. We are really blessed with a great set of panelists, and I do look forward to hearing their presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ilaria. So with no further ado, we're going to start with our speakers. I will remind our speakers to please keep it to about 10 to 12 minutes.
You have 1 hour. So if each speaker speaks for 5 or 6 minutes, you will have a little bit of time for questions and discussion among them and among the audience.
Okay, so my math is clearly off. So I will not do any further calculations today, and remind our panelists to keep their comments to about 5 to 6 minutes, and I will do my best to let you know if it's going a little too far. So we will start with Professor Simi Payne.
Thank you so much. I want to greet everyone wherever you are and thank the organizers for the invitation to speak in what is a very important session. And I'd also like to begin by saying that I'm speaking today from the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape, which is on the east coast of the United States. I'll focus my remarks on the high seas in the context of the Kyoto Guidelines and the resolution that was adopted by the International Law Association in 2020. I had the honor to participate in the work of the ILA Committee on the role of international law and sustainable natural resources management for development, which was responsible for the Kyoto Guidelines, and of course, for which Marie-Claire was the rapporteur, and I think many of the other participants in this were also on the committee. So I want to focus on the role of law in 4 key areas. First, the need for the states parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity to commit to the 30% protected areas by 2030 goal to include the high seas. And for observer states, being from the United States, I have to say this, to commit themselves as well to this goal. Second, for a precautionary pause on deep seabed mining. Third, for the need for a robust BBNJ agreement to be finalized in March. And finally, for a renewed commitment to real flag state oversight. The International Law Association Committee report said the following: international law, both reflects and also serves as a critical catalyst for the design, adoption, and implementation of sustainable natural resource management and resolution of disputes in relation to use of natural resources. The world's natural resources, once seen as national and subject to permanent sovereignty, are now increasingly recognized as eliciting common global, regional, transboundary, and national concerns, thereby challenging international law to provide more coherent, effective, cooperative regimes for sustainable management. This is even more true for areas beyond national jurisdiction, whose marine component is referred to sometimes as international waters, as the high seas, the area, or the open ocean. We've had slow recognition of the true nature of the ocean. The traditional and economic view has been historically as a source of food and for navigation, then increasingly for offshore oil and gas, now for other minerals, and the future of the blue economy, which will include carbon dioxide sequestration fueled by carbon offset credits. We need to work to inculcate the norm of care for shared spaces. An industry spokesman in a workshop I was at recently was talking about field testing their carbon dioxide removal technology in the middle of the ocean because there isn't anyone there to be bothered by it. That couldn't be more wrong. It is rich in life, largely unknown. You can see I brought some of my friends along today. Fortunately, we see in parallel to the expansion of industrial extractive uses of the ocean, awareness of the need for effective governance. In 2015, Sustainable Development Goal, Life Below Water. At this very COP for the CBD, here, the current challenge is to ensure that at least 30% of the ocean, both within and beyond national jurisdiction, is conserved by 2030, with enforceable rights and duties of states. Christina Voigt just really underscored some of the aspects of this that we need to pay attention to. And that some states are actually proposing to, at this meeting, to exclude areas beyond national jurisdiction from the 30 by 30 goal. That is nearly half the surface of Earth. The Kyoto guidelines of the ILA also say the natural resources of the global ocean and its ocean basins are subject to overarching duties of conservation and cooperation. These obligations don't entirely derive from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but they are embedded there. Recent inquiries have asked whether the 1982 convention is still fit for purpose. And the conclusion of those discussions has generally been yes, with the caveat that we need stronger implementation of the obligations in the convention to protect the marine environment, those obligations that condition the rights to exploit the ocean. And yet there are challenges. The Kyoto guidelines point out that account must be taken of renewable or non-renewable character of the resource, the interdependence of ecological systems which sustain the resource, the best available science and technology, distributive justice, substantive equality, and benefit sharing considerations. All are relevant to deep seabed mining. Deep seabed mining poses significant risk to biodiversity-rich areas that have barely been studied by marine scientists. An unfortunate provision in the governing law was triggered almost 2 years ago. It could result in virtually unregulated mining of our shared seabed. Application of the Kyoto guidelines would support implementation of the critical conservation principles found in the convention and the position that many states are now taking, that there should be a precautionary pause on seabed mining until scientific knowledge and technology are sufficiently mature to conduct it safely, and until there is a governance regime that is sufficiently reliable in place. The Kyoto Guidelines also refer to progressive development of international law and policy, which is in the process of integrating the traditional law of the sea with science-based international environmental law. My own work has especially concentrated on implementing this guideline by supporting the negotiation of a new legally binding agreement on conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. You'll be familiar to you as the BB&J agreement, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, which seeks to give meaning to the Kyoto Guideline. Marine biodiversity conservation is recognized as a common concern of humankind. Another important principle that remains a difficult negotiation is equity, common heritage of mankind for marine genetic resources that are found in areas beyond national jurisdiction. This is really related closely to the issues mentioned by Jorge Cabrera and that are being discussed in the room nearby. Finally, none of this can be achieved without real enforcement by flag states. If we can secure these 4 governance measures, we will have essential tools for sustainable stewardship of marine biodiversity, even as our industrial uses for the ocean expand. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Payne. Ocean's a topic very dear to my heart, and love that you brought your friends with you. We are going to now move over to our Cambridge node, and we will ask Professor Marcus Gehring from the University of Cambridge to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Constantia. And we're slightly struggling with the OWL technology because it's not zooming in, or it has a slight time delay. I hope the audience can hear us really well. I just wanted to briefly continue where Professor Payne so ably left us off, because I think there's a common misunderstanding that natural resources, especially those resources based within the territorial jurisdiction of just one state, just belong to that state, and the state could just manage those resources without any regard for the rest of the international community. If we've learned anything in the adoption of the ILA guidelines, and I should say that there are others much more qualified in the room. I just participated in the discussions on behalf of ILA Germany, and our discussions were very fruitful, because I think what we discovered relatively early in the 8-year process with 49 legal experts from over 30 countries and many discussion sessions is that common misunderstanding still permeates some of the legal orders, even of more advanced economies, or especially in some of the more advanced economy. I think what our deliberations focused on were, first of all, the global natural resources that have been recognized as common concerns or common heritage of humankind, such as celestial bodies, the atmosphere, the climate system, but also biodiversity and ecological systems, the oceans, and those resources, but then also regional transboundary natural resources. It's almost impossible to discuss resources without looking beyond the national boundaries, without seeing the international. So let me circle back to the sustainable management of global natural resources. most importantly, the global dimension of biodiversity protection. I think so many countries haven't internalized that. I think many countries now realize that a made-at-home solution to climate change will never work, right? It's a global challenge. We need international collaboration, but we haven't seen the same amount of legal analysis, governance analysis that would bring us to that same point with regards to biodiversity. I think the negotiations currently in Montreal are incredibly important. I'm delighted to see that lawyers and governance specialists are working together with the scientists. And here I would echo what Professor Vogt from the University of Oslo said. The science is crystal clear. The current decline of biodiversity will lead not just to extinction events, but to a surrounding crisis with regards to diversity, and in its dimension almost of the same magnitude as the climate emergency. And I think internalizing, knowing that countries have an obligation to preserve that biological diversity for humanity is an absolutely crucial step. I strongly recommend everyone to read our guidelines, understand our guidelines, and then to challenge anyone who says, oh, whether I'm opening a new coal mine in the north of England is just my own decision. No one else should have a say on that. I think the UK government is rightly being challenged on that, and we need many more governments being challenged on decisions that have a similarly great biodiversity. Thank you very much, Constantia.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you very much. And you will notice a theme throughout these speakers referring to the ILA guidelines. And as I mentioned, International Law Association has a lot of committees that work on a lot of these topics, that put out these guidelines that you can find online. And they tend to be guidelines in the sense of where the law is today and where it probably should be heading. And so that could be some useful resources for a lot of you. And continuing on the ILA trajectory, I would like to welcome Professor Alexandra Harrington, who is a lecturer at the Lancaster University, and I believe a member of ILA Canada, ILA Colombia, ILA probably England soon.
I do have to thank you for the reminder, Constantia. Thanks very much for the reminder.
ILA everywhere. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to see such good friends in the room. And I will hopefully be in Montreal in several days and get to see some of you in person. But welcome to not sunny, not lovely Northern England, where, again, we are talking about coal mines. So thank you, Marcus, for bringing up my daily conversations. So what I wanted to talk briefly about today kind of builds from both Simi and Marcus. And that is something very new that we had not really contemplated except as a theoretical at the time that we were drafting the ILA guidelines, but that now has become quite critical. And we just finished our discussions on about a week and a half ago, and that is the new effort to create a plastics treaty, which started, it was authorized by UNEA in the summer in its session in Dakar, after it had initially given approval in resolution 5/14 from May, and eventually we held the first session of the negotiations at the end of November into the beginning of December online and in Punta del Este in Uruguay. So this is the first session of 5 intended negotiating sessions. The charge is that this treaty be finished and ready to be handed to UNEA for approval at the end of 2024. Now, as we have seen from Simi and BB&J, we hope this works. We shall see. But this is at least what we have been tasked with as a group. And as chair of the IUCN WCL task force on this, we've been doing a great deal of work kind of on preparatory ideas and issues. But what has come up in both our background work and then also the discussions last week, and the sessions moving forward, is something that is quite critical in this context for biodiversity. And that is that when we think of biodiversity, we think of climate change impacts. We think, as has been pointed out, of national impacts more often than we do necessarily of international impacts, because we tend to think of biodiversity as ours. Whatever yours is, whatever country you're in, whatever region you're in, we tend to think of it as ours. But as has been pointed out, that is no longer the case. We know this scientifically, we know this technically, and resources are shared. Birds are shared, marine life are shared. Everything essentially is a shared resource and has an impact transboundary because of the way that the world is set up. What we have seen emerging from this very new context of the plastics treaty is an understanding that biodiversity is absolutely critical, and that biodiversity is one of the areas that has had the greatest impact from plastic pollution, both domestically and internationally. And that as we come to understand the way that plastic streams work and the way that we have to regulate them in a way that is very much suggested by the ILA guidelines. We have to regulate them in a transboundary way. We have to regulate plastic pollution in a way that addresses it as an environmental issue, but also a human rights issue, and as a trade issue, and as multiple aspects of various issues come together regionally and internationally in terms of existing law and how we can build on that law to create a really innovative treaty. But in the context of biodiversity, this is truly crucial because we think often of the images of animals, sea animals in particular, having stomachs full of plastic, which is poignant. We think of dolphins ensnared in fishing nets, which is equally poignant. But what we don't often think of is the massive impact that it's had on the various forms of ecosystems around the world that are being degraded by plastics, not only that we can see, but also what we can't see in terms of microplastics. So as we're looking at what comes out of COP15, and as we're looking at what is going to be adopted for our guidepost for the next 10 years or beyond, coming out of this COP, it is very important to remember that not only will it have a direct link to the CBD and associated protocols, but this will also have a great impact on things like new negotiations for the plastics treaty, as well as obviously things like the climate change regime and other forms of regimes that are all interlinked as we come to truly understand the science of biodiversity. So I see Constantia turning around. I know her well enough to know that's a sign to end and wrap up. So I will end and wrap up, but thank you all very much. And again, if you are in Montreal next week, please let me know. I would love to get together for a coffee. And I'm looking forward to the Montreal weather in December, which is very sad. But anyway, thank you very much.
Are you sure you're looking forward to the weather?
No, not really. I'm trying, positive thinking.
Alexandra, and of course, Alexandra brought up the plastic treaties, and that, of course, is something very important. I ran a project in Mexico for 2.5 years, just outside of Cabo San Lucas, on trying to figure out what to do with plastic, which of course is a major situation in that part of the world. And what we discovered after 2.5 years is getting plastic out of a community, even what would be considered a small, relatively easy to get around community, was incredibly difficult. So I look forward to discussing the topic further. So from the north of England, we are going to go to Brazil, which I'm sure probably has much nicer weather. So Alessandra Lehmann, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Constantia. Unfortunately, the weather is not as nice as one would expect right now due to the scorching heat, which has been, of course, becoming worse over the years. So that's climate change for you. So I wanted to thank the organizers for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually today. Also, thanks Ilaria for the kind introduction. So what I wanted to do today, very, very briefly in the interest of time, is to address the panel's invitation to reflect on challenges and opportunities for advancing biodiversity conservation in other areas of international law. And being primarily a climate lawyer, I wanted to start by saying that the world faces increasingly urgent twin crises. So biodiversity loss and climate change have been treated separately for a long time, but they actually go hand in hand, and they threaten irreversible changes to the global environment. Changes that, and I wanted to echo Marcus on this, are well established by science at this point. And these changes will, of course, profoundly impact the well-being of billions of people around the world. So, as I said, there is a fundamental link between these two crises. So, on the one hand, climate change is a key driver of biodiversity loss. So it increases the severity and frequency of hazards such as droughts and floods. It changes the ranges in which species can thrive. It alters food webs. It affects times and patterns of reproduction, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, degradation of ecosystems, and particularly deforestation, is releasing enormous volumes of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and also at the same time reducing the ability of natural systems to continue to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. The good news is that we know now that nature has immense potential to offer solutions for the climate crisis. And we also know how much nature can contribute to addressing other threats, including water security, food security, disaster risk management, and also health threats. I think it's always important to point out that biodiversity loss actually increases the risk of future pandemics. And an example of these solutions, and there are several that I wanted to pinpoint because of its relevance, and also because its links to climate change and biodiversity have been acknowledged only a bit late in the game, is the fact that the oceans are the largest or active carbon pool on Earth, and the fact that it stores 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere and 8 to 10 times more CO2 than terrestrial ecosystems. It is, of course, an important carbon sink. Since 1970, oceans have absorbed more than, according to the IPCC, more than 90% of the accumulated energy of anthropogenic global warming, and about 30% of CO2 emissions. But the problem is that in doing so, oceans have helped moderate climate change significantly, but this climate benefit has come at a serious cost to the oceans themselves. So we know now that according to the US EPA, global average sea surface temperatures have already increased by 0.5 degrees Celsius since 1980, and the oceans are 30% more acidic than 150 years ago. This, of course, has significant impacts on biodiversity. So moving on to another subject, in this exercise of exploring challenges and opportunities in other areas of international law, I also wanted to very briefly highlight that trade must also be part of the solution to biodiversity loss. And there are, of course, several ways of doing this. So, for example, just last Tuesday, members of the European Parliament reached a preliminary deal with EU governments on a new law on deforestation-free products, which aims basically to prevent companies from selling into the European market cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, soil, and woods that are linked to deforestation around the world. And this, of course, has huge implications for commodities exporters that are often also mega diverse countries, including my home country of Brazil. So if formally approved by EU Parliament and Council, which is expected, the law will make it mandatory for companies to issue a due diligence statement, acknowledging that goods placed on the European market have not led to deforestation and forest degradation anywhere in the world after the 31st of December 2020. It also establishes fines of up to 4% of the annual turnover, which is a very practical measure. And so in my opinion, it's also important because it makes deforestation material for corporations, with everything, of course, materiality entails in terms of mandatory disclosures and investor rights. So finally, I want to close this very brief intervention and this also very brief exercise of identifying challenges and opportunities in other areas of the law by mentioning that in seeking to address climate change, the Paris Agreement has led the way in demonstrating that it is possible to forge a collective global consensus around the shared environmental goal. So there are very high hopes for COP15 in the sense that a similar agreement can be reached, a similar deal can be reached during the conference, so that we have a defined set of processes and mechanisms to work towards biodiversity goals as we do in the climate change regime. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. Now I think I will move on to, we have two speakers left, and Cairo will sort of discuss more than present and sort of put some of these points together. Of course, they all interlink. So I think I will go to Maria del Pilar Vanegas Guzman, who is the president of ILA Colombia. And so from president to president, welcome, and I give you the floor. Okay.
Hello. Well, first of all, Marie-Claire, it's an honor to be here with you. I want to congratulate you. I met you possibly a decade ago at the atrium, and I'm really impressed by the perseverance and persistence in this work. It's really amazing. Also, I want to thank Alexandra, who has been really supportive to ILA Colombia in many ways. So she's an important integral part of our association. So and thank you, Ilaria, for the very kind presentation, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I did not prepare a presentation. I'm not a scholar, strictly speaking, in this area of law. And I thought I would just make a few comments in areas that are related to Colombia, from what the speakers have said. And I would say that one main objective in my comments, in my questions rather, my aim would be to raise awareness to the situation in Colombia after the signature of the peace agreement with the FARC in 2016, and the implications that this positive process of peace has had on biodiversity. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure to visit Colombia, it's just a few words to study to you. But Colombia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, and it has about 10% of the biodiversity of the entire planet. And this is in a small territory, like 440,000 square meters alone. So it's pretty condensed. And the richness that you find ranges from birds and butterflies. There is so much variety that we're still discovering new species. So on the one hand, we don't have the mapping of what we actually have there in terms of biodiversity. And we had not accessed the territory because, believe it or not, conflict had this positive impact of protecting the environment because the areas were not accessible to people because of security, and investors would not come to those areas, to other areas yet. So now you have these wonderful green lands, rich, with nature and biodiversity growing in front of your eyes, literally. This is not metaphor. It's literally you go and you see green, the green and nature like vibrant and then in front of your eyes. But now, because of the peace agreement, so all these areas are now open to investors for accessing, for mining, and this has created a very, very big concern for those who protect biodiversity. Now, going back to what Professor Gering said, I agree, and this is a question also. I agree, and I question the responsibility for the project. It's not just ownership of the biodiversity, that it belongs to everyone. For me, it's a treasure, and we should protect it somehow. But it's also a responsibility. Now, the responsibility is also with respect to the corporations that come from foreign countries, including Canada. Canada is one of the most important mining countries in the world. And so what is the oversight? The oversight in your country, in our countries, I'm also Canadian, I'm a proud Canadian. So I think there should be more oversight, and it's not a matter of the state, it's also a matter of the private sector and corporations. And I would be very interested to know how this fits in the efforts, for future action in the implementation of the ILA guideline. And there is also, there's a lot of, in international law, and in Colombia as well, there's a vast variety of legal instruments. So it's not just the developing laws and implementing laws, because implementation is understood as the incorporation, in the legal system. But the actual processes, how it is being applied. And I give you an example. Why am I making this obvious point? Corporations, like mining corporations, they have excellent lawyers. So they interpret all these legislations and laws, to their convenience, as any company would do. They work for their interests. So to give you an example, in terms of before the guidelines, before the SDG principles, there was a focus on consultation. We know about consultation of indigenous communities and of the people in the area, and so it was like a formal consultation. It was no real consultation. Now, because we have moved from that compliance aspect, now mining companies are looking to implement the SDG. So they have appropriated this language, this beautiful sustainable development language, in their not only compliance, in their guidelines. They have internal guidelines. So maybe some of you have heard of the King's Principles. Have you heard of the King's Principles? So the King's Principles is a sustainable development principles adopted by mining corporations in South Africa. So the directors of the mining companies got together and to meet the expectations, to meet the requirements, the new requirements. So they got together and they devised ways to be sustainable development compliant. So have we looked at that? How does that interact with the ILA guidelines? And this is not something that's old, but it's not new. It's from 2016. They adopted this. And now they're coming certain companies are coming with the same principles, the same King's Principles, Sustainable Development King's Principles, to Colombia. But we know what's happened in South Africa. So how reliable, how compliant really are these principles? And I would invite you in your research to take a look at that and see how you know how corporations are playing around, maybe in good faith, you know, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. But when you go to the field, you don't really see. So we adopt. So this is the point. There's a lot of formality. There are ways to sell and to appropriate the sustainable development of guidelines, rhetoric, wording, principles, philosophy, but we don't see it in practice. So there is some oversight to do there. There is something happening. I'm going to close it here. There is something happening in Colombia, which is not, you know, the peace agreement wasn't signed, and there was already a lot of effort, ready, prepared to go and exploit those territories by way of a set of mechanisms. So this is the deal with a set of mechanisms. The mining companies or others, they go and use their certain area, and they commit to recreate a similar environment elsewhere, you know, like to compensate for the destruction of a certain area. So for me, that is quite concerning, you know, like what is the advantage? So it's like, what is the trade-off there? Let's go and destroy a certain space, but we're going to protect the space next door or recreate. Now, biodiversity. Colombia has like 314 ecosystems. So there you see, you know, like the wealth. But once you destroy it, you cannot recreate it. You cannot read this set of agreements, this set of ideas. There is something that I would also invite you to examine and see how critically they would really comply with the principles. So there are many other areas of the world that also, because of conflict, are going through similar situations. DRC, and so just a last one, and very brief, just a few seconds for Alexandra in the idea of the plastic treaty. I think conflict areas and post-conflict areas should be included in the analysis. Right now, you've heard of the Darien Gap, I imagine. So this is the area in between Panama and Colombia where all the migrants are moving. So this is the land that was humid, and it is still, you know, it's a reserve of biodiversity. And now, because of the passage of people fleeing conflict, it's so polluted in a certain area that it's quite devastating. So that's something else that I wanted to point out to Alexandra.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. Thank you so much. And this is the world we live in the digital age, right? You see somebody 100 times on the screen, and then you can't recognize them in real life.
Yeah.
So my apologies.
It's great that you have appeared in the room.
Where did she come from? So our last speaker for today is Kyra Robb, who is going to make certain points. And Kyra, if it works on what is even more close to my heart than oceans, if that's even possible, and that normally she works on soil. So no pressure to speak on soil. Should you want to, I would be very happy.
Hi, Constante. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure. Yes, you can. Okay, great. Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's been great to hear what everyone has had to say. I am not quite sure how much I am. I think there may have been some slight cross wires, and it would be difficult for me to wrap up because there have been quite technical difficulties. So I haven't heard everything that's been said, but I would very much like to talk about soil for a bit. So I wanted to say that I'd just like to note, I suppose, that COP15 and the Biodiversity Law and Governance Day follows hot on the heels of the United Nations World Soil Day, which was earlier this week on Monday. And that itself follows on from International Soil Governance Conference that took place in Vienna, the university, virtually from the University of Vienna and the University of Graz just a couple of months ago, which itself followed on from the World Congress of Soil Science this year, the quadrennial World Congress of Soil Science that took place in Glasgow in the UK, which had its first ever soil policy program, which was a first and is great. And it's basically thanks very much to the work of the FAO, the Global Soil Partnership, and UNEP's work on soils, among many others, that soils are becoming, we are becoming more aware of soils, but certainly not enough. So I'm very pleased that even though our ILA working committee and work on the guidelines started many years ago, we did include land and soils. And we included them as national resources, but it was very important that we also took a lot of care to point out that they are indeed of sort of I would suggest common concern. We didn't quite say that, but definitely of global and regional relevance, including in relation to the conservation and including in relation to the sustainable management of the atmosphere and a stable climate system, and the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. As you may know, over 25% of biodiversity lives entirely in the soil or litter layer, and around about 40% of biodiversity spends at least part of their life cycle in the soil. And I would like to then say that there are therefore a number of ways to consider soil and its biodiversity within the framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So first, biodiversity includes soil biodiversity. And so soil biodiversity is already implicitly captured in the CBD and its mainstreaming agenda. And the challenge remains to make it explicit and of consequence in practice. Second, soil, including and going beyond its biotic factors, forms a habitat for soil biodiversity. And so for that reason also forms part of soil biodiversity. Third, the diversity of soil and the vegetation that relies upon it form part of the ecological complex upon which above ground biodiversity depends, and so again must be considered part of biodiversity. And fourth, in any case, healthy soils which support effective soil functioning and soil processes support more diversity of species, so promoting healthy soils provides a means of implementing the objective of the convention. And finally, the ecosystem approach, which provides for integrated management of land, water, and living resources, is a primary framework for action under the convention. So whichever way we look at it, there is scope for much more attention to be paid to soil and its biodiversity within the implementation of the convention. And through the cross-cutting international initiative on the conservation and sustainable use of soil biodiversity, which is at Agenda 24, item 24 on the agenda for the draft decision from COP15, hidden under the words biodiversity and agriculture. But I would like to just emphasize the point that it's already there in the convention, implicitly. And so while the updated plan of action for that initiative is very important, we ought to be thinking of it anyway. And the Kyoto guidelines provide guidance on measures that can be taken to promote sustainable soil management, including national soil policies. And also, I would like to highlight that they also mention echoing the World Charter, the revised World Charter, and echoing what the last speaker was talking about, the importance of all stakeholders. And in that I didn't fully hear everything that was said, but in that context, I would like to mention, for example, the importance of real practical action to take us from this aspiration or to including soil-related provisions in contracts and other transactional documents. And for example, I don't know if anyone's heard of the Chancery Lane project based in London, they have a SORNS clause, which is Sustainable Soil Management Obligations clause, that could be used by companies who are trying to be forward thinking in integrating elements of soil consciousness into their work. So I will just end by saying that implementation of the mainstreaming agenda. Implementation of the mainstreaming agenda of the CBD must incorporate mainstreaming of soil biodiversity. The international initiative, as I say, can be seen as simply emphasizing this and providing a potential framework for action. And that in many instances, threats to terrestrial biodiversity and the impact of drivers of terrestrial biodiversity loss may first be played out in the soil, with the consequences of land use change, soil sealing, pollution, and intensive agricultural production producing the first casualties in the soil. And as Carlos Guerra has pointed out or suggested, soil organisms are like the canaries in the coal mine. And I mean, much of what I said, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was there. I thought I was not on the screen.
Yeah, you are.
I'm really sorry, I would have been looking up. I wasn't there to begin with. Much of what Simi was saying has parallels in the soil, the deep sea bed, and the amazing unidentified life that's there, and the benefits to humanity. So I'll stop there. Just my main point being that we must not forget that soil biodiversity is part of biodiversity and should be in the mainstreaming agenda, and can provide levers, for example, in situations as was talked about perhaps in the Colombia context. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cairo, and I agree with everything you say. Of course, soil is the forgotten natural resource that we have, whether we're talking about health, whether we're talking about nutrition, food security, climate change, biodiversity, you name it, it is a critical asset. So that's something that I hope we'll discuss more. So we have now with us also a moderator, Diana Quevedo. And I believe, Diana, we have Carla from the Cambridge node that has a question. How does that work?
Marcus will let you.
Marcus, okay.
Carla, do you want to ask your question? The owl will automatically focus on you.
Sorry.
We talked when we talked about the direct link of species protection and natural resources management. And I think what would be interesting here in the Cambridge node is to hear how, for example, other legal systems, other cultures deal with the importance, on the one hand, of species protection, and the sort of need for population to also have an income, to manage the land, to have agriculture. I think Carla earlier in our informal conversation talked about and what we could perhaps learn from that environment. Was that right, Carla?
Yeah.
So the owl confuses the best of us, Carla, not to worry. I have no idea where to look at, or and it's just kind of like, I feel like it's watching me, but not. It is really kind of, anyway, so not a problem there. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions at once, and we'll go between online and live. Yes.
Okay. My name is Alice Hughes. I work for the University of Hong Kong, and I've worked in the Asia Pacific region for most of the last 20 years. I had a question for the first speaker, one of the major problems with setting targets in the high seas, as you'll be very well aware, is they're very challenging to enforce because they don't fall within the territorial remits of any country. And so any form of enforcement action can be very challenging, as can setting areas. In addition, with regards to areas of disputes like the South China Sea, where there are some critically important regions for marine biodiversity, it's very close to the Coral Triangle. How do you see setting targets and enforcing targets in these regions, given those challenges?
Okay. So we'll just collect a couple of more questions and then go to the various panelists for answers. Do we have anyone else online, or we'll go a second one here and then we'll see.
So just sort of reflecting on the discussion about making management of natural resources, viewing it more as an international global concern. I was just wondering about how that interacts with an equally important concern of putting natural resources in the hands of local communities, indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, and whether there's any tension there or whether we think those are very compatible goals.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll.
I just want to add to next to that very interesting question about enforcement. More than just targets, I would be curious to know if anyone has thought about what legal tools could be created and implemented for enforcement, whereas we are the lack of jurisdiction by nation states. Do there need to be police, how would we prosecute crimes, and yeah.
Okay, so for the first, so I think there were questions for Simi. There was the question on enforcement could go to several people, I believe, but perhaps Alessandra could get things going on that question. And with regards to Indigenous local communities, I think Alexandra Harrington could start the discussion, and pretty much most of us could jump in. So
there's two questions on the chat that Deanna could possibly lead out. There are observations as well, Professor Larry Swatuk and Frank Kazesi. If Deanna could read them out. Alessandra had just commented on the chat behind you,
okay.
Constantia,
No
that she would be willing to address one of them.
Yes, absolutely. So the first question that we have is from Frank Kazesi, and it is, I really appreciate the vision of all speakers, but in fact, when we face World Bank project executives fundings, large dam superstructures destroying key biodiversity areas, we are far from the shared vision of biodiversity protection of the participant. So we should harden the application of biodiversity protection at the top international level. How shall we ensure them to follow the international guidelines you are developing?
And was there a second comment?
And we also have one comment, and it's in relation to the international water law. Larry Swatuk says that there is a space for conservation, ecosystem health, and biodiversity preservation through two key substantive rules. The first one is the right to equitable and reasonable utilization, and the second one is the duty to do not cause significant harm. These are accompanied by rules of process, such as duty to cooperate and the exchange of information, which seems to provide a space for other groups and perspectives to actively contribute. So, for example, concepts such as environmental flow can be embedded in treaty through do not cause significant harm as baseline measure that respects ecosystem health. So that's the comment we have.
Okay, thank you so much, Diana. Okay, so to go to the questions, I think we will start with the first question that was asked directly to Professor Payne, and then we will continue with the others.
Sorry, a little button confusion there. So it's an excellent point. Enforcement's always a problem, and it's particularly difficult in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Even with the fish stocks agreement, which has extremely detailed provisions for enforcement, we still have lots of illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. So you can see that this is going to be a tremendous challenge for biodiversity. The approach that's being taken in the BB&J negotiation is to use information tools like environmental impact assessment and protected areas, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, to try to set aside places and to focus global attention through transparency mechanisms on activities that may be harmful. So it's not a targets and timetables kind of approach, but it's only going to be effective if the states that are registering ships out on the ocean take their responsibilities seriously. And that has not been the case. The international community has not been willing to pressure flags of convenience to take up their responsibilities. I think this is where we have a tremendous role, as do civil society organizations, to demand that, to be eyes on the actors. And I particularly, along those lines, I particularly appreciated the point that I think it may have been Maria made, that, for instance, we talk about Canadian, we should talk more about Canadian mining interests, about US plastics companies, because they are the source of a lot of these problems. They're the source of the capital, even though they're deploying it elsewhere. And our instruments aren't dealing with that. Thank you for the question.
Okay. So if we'll move on to the question about Indigenous communities and local communities. And before I hand that over to anyone, I will, as chair, to say one thing. We know that with regards to a lot of conservation projects, they have not taken into consideration Indigenous interests. In fact, a lot of Indigenous communities and a lot of local communities are very skeptical of a lot of these sort of grand schemes to preserve the ecosystems, and they should be, because they control about 1/3 of the Earth's surface. And in that 1/3 of the Earth's surface, we find 80% of our biodiversity. So the idea is, and they have very good ideas and ways of doing this conservation, but we sort of still insist on coming in with, ideas made externally, which do not necessarily work. So if that's going to be a thing, then the ideas and the how has to come in from the communities and be community led. But I'm sure some of our panelists have much to say on this. So if anybody would like to jump in, please go ahead.
So I would be happy to jump in. I think you had nominated me to jump in anyway, so I will jump in quickly and just point out before I'm being forced. It is an excellent question. It is a dynamic that can be potentially quite valuable or potentially quite harmful, depending on how treaties are written and depending on how they are applied. There is a way to think of a treaty as actually being very helpful to Indigenous communities by providing recognition, by providing a space, by doing things like including impact assessments where we have free, prior, and informed consent, etc. There's also a way for them to be very damaging by not including all of these. And it's not only the text of a treaty, it's what comes after. It's something like whatever it comes out of Montreal, out of this COP. It's something like what was in Aichi and what we see in the Paris Agreement, etc. And it's actually fascinating just to bring it back to what has become my life, which is the Plastics Treaty, because and Simi's smiling because she predicted this would happen when we talked about this, but interestingly, a number of states, small island states, but also not small island states, larger developed states, have actually stressed the need for the treaty regime in whatever form it takes to include traditional and local knowledge. Obviously, plastics are not necessarily part of traditional and local knowledge. Thank you, Simi. But the ways to clean up the environment, the ways to respect the environment and to give priority very much are part of Indigenous and traditional practices. And so it's been fascinating to see how that comes in. So hopefully this will be a treaty where we do see the benefit there. But it is something that as international lawyers, as practitioners or scholars or both, we do need to always be aware of in the international context. And we do always need to think of how does something that is an amendment or that even is a policy impact communities that are very local, even as we're trying to work at the very high level global. So I've said enough, but thank you.
Yes, we're speaking of Indigenous communities, and we're often accused about speaking about them without them, and I think perhaps this is what might be in the process of doing, especially when we have an Indigenous lawyer in Indigenous trade that probably has a few comments on this topic that of course he's not obligated to share, but we would very much welcome them.
Happy to, thank you. Yes, looking at Indigenous challenges with respect to biodiversity, it's more a failure to communicate, a failure to listen to Indigenous peoples. And it's Indigenous law and Indigenous philosophies, which is not to be confused with nation state Indian law. It's Indigenous law, Indigenous philosophy, which is tied to the ecosystem. It's tied to how one lives within the ecosystem and not over it. The Western philosophy, the Western concept is to be the master of the environment, to control the resource. The Indigenous philosophy is more akin to the line of you live within the biodiversity, the ecosystem, and you are part of it. So your teachings, your learnings are all in relationship to the various spheres that you have to work with. I use the Secwepemc people of the southern interior of British Columbia, for example. They have river chiefs, they have berry chiefs, they have woodland chiefs, and various different types of masters of the knowledge which they pass on and is respected to allow for the community to take only what they need and no more. And the chief or the master of the knowledge knows that the ecosystem must be preserved for the Indigenous philosophy of, for example, the seventh generation, where one does not make an adverse decision that would adversely affect the seventh generation, a generation you will never know in the future, but you have an obligation to preserve that environment, preserve that biosphere for future generations. So your decisions, your philosophy is not over, but within.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. That was very to the point, I think, because I would phrase the question: how can Indigenous wisdom inform the analysis? And I think the timing, the timing of involvement should not be too late, but rather before decisions are taken, before contracts are signed, before governments grant licenses. So sometimes it comes too late. And I recall when I was a child, we speak about the motherland. We don't, it's more like above us, before us. And the gods were nature, elements of nature, those were the gods. So it's a question also of treating nature with respect. And I think that is lacking. And this sounds, not very legal, not a very legal comment, but I think those are the kind of values that we should start involving. Now, speaking of enforcement, if I may, which I think is so important, I have a lot to do with international criminal law. And you've heard about universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. And this is something I'm writing on, and I think that crimes against nature are as horrendous as healing. And I think a way of enforcing is start to think about the universal jurisdiction for crimes against the nature.
I've been
Yeah.
asked by the online participants, they've given us an extra 20 minutes, and we are now 5 minutes before the hard stop at 11:20. We wanted to have a hard stop at 11:15, so everyone can get coffee, but I've been authorized by the online participants who are waiting to start the next section, that if everyone can agree to go to their next session, grabbing coffee on the way, then they will wait patiently in line for us. If that's sort of an acceptable compromise for everyone, then we would have our hard stop at 11:20 rather than 11:15.
Well, that leaves us with one question, short question, if possible. Go ahead.
Yes, if I may. My name is Ira Rupp. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of an organization called Global Choices. We've been looking very much at these areas, and some of you will know, it will not be surprised for me to hear to say that we're particularly using the Arctic as a proving point for many of these issues. Why the Arctic? Because it has the highest concentration of plastic, but also once it's gone, it's gone. We're actually watching the system going extinct under our watch. And so, and there is no recovery. So it's a very interesting place to think about time, because we probably have 10, 20 years. And time is something that law and the way that the process of law operates currently doesn't help. So what are the alternatives? How can we find ways to accelerate protection? And BLGD has some notice of victims. Will there be something similar in the biodiversity treaty? Will there be mechanisms? And that's my question to the guys in this room. We can actually use as leverage. The eco side is being one. I'm actually around the eco side later. But again, that's also a long-term thing. So our proposal really is around a 10-year moratorium, and how useful can these be in being stepping stones to longer protections that maybe will take ongoing things. So question is around time and how to accelerate it. And then I think the other piece of this is that clearly you take something like the Atlantic, you have protections and class, you put the BLGD, other people get that over the line. But then you've got literally undermining provisions for the Eastern Mining Authority and also the Intercontinental Shelf, which have, so the whole thing is really not fit for purpose, and not only in the current purpose now, but in the future. So how can the law be helped, and how can an example like that be a good proving ground for accelerating law?
Did the people online, were they able to hear the question? No, I didn't think so. Okay, so basically the question was, in a place like the Arctic that is facing some serious consequences in terms of the collection of plastics, the collection of everything really from the jet streams, everything ends up in the Arctic. The law, in terms of the question of time, law tends to work very slowly. Are there some alternative mechanisms? We already spoke about the fact that we have enormous amount of legislation, but is there some sort of alternative mechanisms that may maybe push the law to act a little faster, or maybe work as an alternative to the slow motion of the law to help the Arctic in its conundrum? Maybe Professor Payne might have something to say on this.
I can say something fairly quickly. I think we are thinking already in the context of the BB&J agreement. The IUCN team and some of our collaborators came up with an article that was published in one of the Nature publications last month about implementation of the BB&J agreement into national law, and as well as setting up the international institutions. So remembering that international law leads, it can set norms, but it also follows, and it's slow. National action is necessary, and it can go ahead sometimes at a faster pace. So that would be one thing. The other is to work very hard to develop shared norms around this so that the global understanding, this is why I put these guys in my slides now, so that it becomes impossible for us to forget. And Cairo, I want to see your soil background next time we're on a panel together, okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. We're running out of time. I'm just going to pass it over to Ilaria to just sort of say the last maybe 3 to 4 words before we are all cut off.
Yes, thank you so much, Constantia. And thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for sharing your insights on this really urgent and timely topic. I am delighted about the outcome of this session. I don't have much time left, but I would just like to congratulate all the participants and thank all of the audience, both online and in person. It's been wonderful to listen to you, and thank you so very much again.
Thank you, Ilaria, and thank you everyone online and in person. And I think we keep chasing this coffee that keeps coming late, or we're late to it. So perhaps we can go find it and move on to the next panels that will be, I'm sure, just as stimulating. Thank you so much. Thank you.